Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Spicer. I'm a communications officer at the MacArthur Foundation. Today, I'm standing in for my colleague, James Kinzer. He's our Senior Associate of Digital Communications, but he had to tend today to a family emergency and couldn't be here himself. So on behalf of James and the entire team here at MacArthur, I want to thank you all for joining us today for our Inclusive Design Web Accessibility webinar. On the call, we have several hundred MacArthur grantees and other people from the nonprofit sector who are interested in learning more about this topic. Thanks to each of you for taking the time out of your day to learn more about this important and timely topic. For a little bit of background, we at the MacArthur Foundation initially started to address accessibility on our website about 4 years ago. It opened our eyes to the many roadblocks we had inadvertently created for people with disabilities. Along this journey, we recognized the need to help others understand the importance of addressing accessibility too, as well as how to do this better ourselves. Last year, we worked with WebAIM to create an accessibility guide for nonprofits, and now we have asked them to highlight today some key elements from that guide and some other insights on addressing accessibility for your websites. Leading that conversation today is Cindy Rowland and Jonathan Whiting from WebAIM. Cindy and John, thank you so much for being here today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce yourselves and lead our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. So I want to start by introducing us. John and I do hail from WebAIM, and that is a project out of Utah State University. WebAIM's been around now for 20 years, so we've done a lot in the web accessibility community, and certainly with all of the communities that we work with, be it corporate communities, education communities, really just about every social sector that you can imagine we have been working with. I'm the executive director of WebAIM. Jonathan is our director of training, and we're just so honored to have an opportunity to spend an hour with you and talk to you about something that is passionate for both of us, which is web accessibility. But of course, before I get started here, one of the things that I want to do is I want to make sure that the MacArthur Foundation is given proper due for funding this entire effort. I know Jonathan will be sharing with you a little bit later in this broadcast the guide itself and where you can go to find some of the resources that we've pulled together. But had it not been for the MacArthur Foundation contacting us and asking us to do this, none of this would have been possible. So enormous thanks to them for their vision, for their commitment, and for their resources to help get this going. All right, so today we've got a tight hour, and I want to move along here. First, we've got really 4 goals for our time together today. And the first is just to make sure everyone is kind of on the same page with what is accessibility. When we're talking about digital accessibility for folks with disabilities, what in heaven's name are we even talking about? I want to share a little bit about why this concept is so important, specific to your world, the nonprofit world. And I'd like to share a little data that we gathered about 1.5 years ago now on web accessibility in the nonprofit space. Then Jonathan is going to hop in and he's going to introduce the guide and show you some of the resources. He's going to highlight a few of them so you get a sense of the depth that this resource guide has to offer you. And then last, we're going to talk about how you can start, if it's a beginning for you, or continue conversations on accessibility. As part of this webinar, we're going to initiate a discussion forum just for a 2-week period of time. So we really want folks to get engaged. And then as that period rolls to an end, then we'll help connect you to some existing lists that are out there. But I think that in some respects, we are, I don't know, a more comfortable group to start with some of those conversations. Okay, so I'm going to start here with a tiny bit of some context. And the first that I'd want to mention is really about the incidence of disabilities that prohibit or affect computer and internet use. I think that many of the folks listening today are aware of the fact that there are about almost 20%, it's 19 and some change, percent of the US population that has a disability. But of course, not every disability affects computer and internet use. So we need to be looking at, well, what's that subset then of folks with disabilities where web accessibility intersects? And looking at census data and extrapolating from there, it is about 8.5% of the population. And looking at today's population, well, technically population as of 3 days ago, that is nearly 28 million persons in the US. Of course, if you are a nonprofit working in a global context, you would want to extrapolate that out even farther. But that is a goodly amount of individuals. And more specifically, who are we talking about aside from this incidence figure? And we are talking traditionally about 5 different groups of individuals. So it, I'm sure, makes a lot of sense to folks. The people that have problems with their vision would have problems with the internet, because that has traditionally been a visual mode or a visual experience. So folks that are blind, folks that have low vision, and even folks that are colorblind, because there are times when designers that aren't thinking about it may use color alone to denote important differences in content. If you're colorblind, you might not see that. But of course, with technology, folks that don't have the vision that many of us enjoy they use technology, for example, screen readers or screen magnification software to get to all the content that we have on the internet. I'm going to hop over to the right of the slide here. Certainly, it makes sense to a lot of folks that people that have difficulties with their hearing, whether they're deaf or hard of hearing, could have problems with the internet. And that's in part because these days the web is rich and filled with media, with videos, with things that include audio. So in the absence of some captioning, which I'm happy to say, we are exhibiting today. In the absence of the captioning, folks would not have an opportunity to get all of the content that they would want to get to. We also have groups of folks that have either difficulties or differences in the ways that they process things at a cognitive level. Now, certainly we could talk about some that have learning disabilities, whether that is some dyslexia or whether that is a difficult time either taking attention to an element or getting attention away from an element. Those are the, and it may be problem solving. How did I get here? How do I get out? Navigation. There's all kinds of little traps that can happen for folks. But these are people that typically have, well, as I said, learning disabilities, a head injury, a traumatic brain injury would be another example. Folks that are experiencing some form of dementia. And then there are mental health issues that can come into play. So if there's a returning veteran with PTSD, and there is some unpredictable strobing or a loud sound that comes in, or even some visual processing can tap into some unpleasant experiences that they've had. And then second to last category are folks that have a difficult time using a keyboard and a mouse. Now, maybe it's because they don't have the functional use of their hands, para or quadriplegia. Some folks have spasticity. Maybe it's cerebral palsy, maybe it's a neurologic condition, which makes it such that they're not going to be able to reliably use use a mouse, use a keyboard. As folks get older, they are experiencing all kinds of weakness, and their ability to continue to use keyboard and mouse for long periods of time can be compromised. And then for some power users, they're starting to get repetitive stress injuries, repetitive motion issues as well. The last category, believe it or not, is that a poorly designed, or some aspects of a poorly designed website can actually create a seizure state in some individuals. In folks that have a very specific type of epilepsy, it's called photoepilepsy. And I think we're kind of getting to the end of the strobing, flashing, blinking nonsense that we used to have in the past. But it is good to know that if your content has any of that, you may very unwittingly, unknowingly, innocently be creating a problem for someone else. Okay, now we're going to get to, that's kind of just the context, and now we're going to get into the meat of the matter here. So what is web accessibility? Well, I think a lot of you can figure out all on your own what we're talking about. But if for those that are just a little unsure of how you would kind of bind this in a definition, I went to good old Wikipedia. Web accessibility is the inclusive practice of ensuring there are no barriers that prevent interaction with or access to websites on the World Wide Web by people with disabilities. So, you know, it's important. There are two separate things here that are critical for you to really understand deeply. It's not just getting access to the information, but it is also the ability to interact with whatever functions you have. So let's say you have a function on your website for someone to be able to go and download a report, or to sign up for your newsletter, or to donate to your nonprofit. Is that full process, is that interaction with the forms and everything else fully accessible? And to continue the end of this slide, when sites are correctly designed, developed, and edited, generally all users have equal access to information and functionality. And that's very, very true. So this is really the aspirational goal here. Of course, there are some technical standards that help back up how it is that we get to this goal, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to just remind everyone that we do have an analogy about digital access, and it starts in the built environment. So some of you may be old enough to remember life before the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the ADA in 1990 started to make the physical environment, the built environment, inclusive. Curb cuts are a perfect example that made it such that persons in a wheelchair could get, you know, onto a curb or cross a street without having to, you know, go over it. And for most of you, you understand what a boon that has been for all of us. I know myself, I love it as a traveler. I use my wheeled luggage up and down those curb cuts. Folks with young children will use their strollers. You see a picture here of a ramp being used by someone who is temporarily disabled, who broke a leg or sprained an ankle or something like that. But we really do have a lot of examples in the physical environment, in the built environment, of how we took something and made it inclusive, made it available for everyone. It provided access to people with disabilities, and it ended up by being a better experience really for all of us. So we want to take that experience, that knowledge of what happened in the built environment, and we want to apply it, frankly, to the digital one. When you think about technology expansion, whether it's smartphones, whether it's tablets, you know, whatever it is, whatever technology it is that you're using now and what you may be using in the future, you know, wearable technologies, things like that. We want to make sure that we're not accidentally putting barriers in there that can, you know, keep some folks out of the experience. I want to share with you some amazing little videos. I'm going to give you a quick little preview of this, but I would invite you to go to the w3c.org, the World Wide Web Consortium, and look at they're called perspective videos. So I'm going to take you here. And of course, I'm just now realizing that the one thing I didn't test as we got started was my audio. So I'm going to hope you guys can hear this. So they have this wonderful, the W3C has this wonderful array of short videos. And they really show how it is that a person with a disability and persons just in the general population benefit from accessible design. They're super quick, so I'm going to give you just a couple examples of this. So here is keyboard compatibility. And let me hit play.
Web accessibility perspectives. Keyboard compatibility. Not being able to use your computer because your mouse doesn't work is frustrating. Many people use only the keyboard to navigate websites, either through preference or circumstance. Whether it's temporarily limited mobility, a permanent physical disability, or simply a broken mouse, the result is the same. Websites and apps need to be operable by keyboard. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all.
Okay. Let me show you one other that is one of my favorites. And let me just mention that I had this same thing happen just yesterday. My mouse ran out of battery power, and I had some real a real tough time getting to the content that I needed with just my keyboard. All right, I'm going to show you guys this one, large links, buttons, and controls. And maybe it's because I'm a woman of a certain age and I'm having problems with some of my own vision. But this does illustrate how something we can do for folks with disabilities really has an impact on everyone.
Web accessibility perspectives. Large links, buttons, and controls. Trying to hit a small target requires lots of effort. Many websites and applications try to thread the needle. But on the web, we can make areas for clicking and tapping larger and easier to use, which is handy on mobile devices, especially when we might be moving around at the time, which is critical for people with reduced dexterity. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives.
All right. Well, you get the sense of this, and we're getting a little tight on time, so I don't want to provide this middle example is the importance of captioning. And I suspect that each of you understand how critical it is that media is captioned for those that don't have hearing, and the benefit it is to all of us in either quiet environments where you need to be quiet or very noisy environments. But I would encourage you to go and play around a little bit with these fabulous videos, because they do provide some nice, very succinct lessons that you can learn. All right, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why accessibility is important for you, important for those of you in the nonprofit world. And it really comes down to three kind of large chunks. One is, frankly, it's just the right thing to do. For many of you, think about what your mission statement is within your nonprofit. I know that for MacArthur, they questioned whether they could say that they were having an effect on a just world if they were excluding part of the population from their content. So for them, it really was a notion of living their mission and of really just doing the right thing. But you've got to ask yourself, you know, does our nonprofit have social responsibility that is important? Is that kind of CSR piece something that is also going to be compatible with our brand and something that we want to be known for? Which folds right into the next reason that this is good for nonprofits. It's that it is a smart choice. It is the smart thing to do. You do reach a wider audience if you're gaining 8.5% of the population. And your content will have greater visibility to search engines. So if you think about the largest blind and deaf user in the world, well, that's Google. So to the extent that your content can be seen by Google, experienced by Google, for example, alternative text on an image, then it can be indexed by Google. And that can have some amazing benefits all on its own. Of course, accessible web is also compatible with emerging technologies, not just of today, but in the directions that we're headed. The economics as well is smart. So I'm going to just give you one example, although I could spend 10 more minutes just on this point alone. Let's say that within your organization, you're also engaged in some development work. So you're trying to tap into a donor pool that's going to help you. You're trying to find those people who are like-minded and would like to be philanthropic and give to the mission and the work of your own nonprofit. Well, we know that there are an awful lot of folks in the aging population that are benefactors of the nonprofit world. And with age come progressive limitations in sight, in hearing, in dexterity. We also know that persons in the disability world themselves do enjoy participating in development efforts. So can those folks do that? If you're excluding those folks, there may be a real impact to you and to your organization. The last reason that a nonprofit really ought to be thinking about this is, frankly, that it's the law. So we know in the US that there are laws on the books. We know that there are legal complaints now, there's litigation now. Of course, we at WebAIM never like to think that that's what's driving the bus here. But for some, we do understand that it's important for them to comply with legal mandates. And I'd like to just mention, too, that for any of you that are working in an international context, the United Nations has the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, and in it, in the CRPD, is an Article 9, and it's accessibility. And it covers both the built environment as well as the digital environment. Most member states of the UN have signed on, have ratified the CRPD. Now, the United States is not one of them, but most have. So if you're working out in the broader world, just know that there may be local laws that are in place that would require that your content is accessible as well. Okay, I'm gonna try to clip along here a little quicker. I'm kind of curious as to how you guys think the nonprofits are doing on accessibility, and it would be interesting to hear that in the chat. Although I know we wouldn't have time to go back and reflect on that. But if anyone wants to just make a comment there, that would be great. I'd love to look at it later myself. About a year and a half ago, WebAIM took 100 web pages, and we took them from the topnonprofits.com. So we took their list of the top 100 nonprofits. We only looked at their homepage, nothing else. And the rationale there was, well, that's usually the homepage. That's usually where people give something a little extra love. They're going to spend more resources, more time, more energy, kind of getting the branding right and the zeitgeist just right. And that's where you would think that front door of the organization might have more attention and might attend to accessibility if accessibility is a part of it. We ran it through WAVE, which is a web accessibility evaluation tool that WebAIM develops and is free and available for folks to use. And looked not at every aspect of web accessibility, but we looked at just some low-hanging fruit, or what are some items that are automatically discernible by the technology. I'm curious how you think 100 homepages of nonprofits did, but the drum roll, please. 97% of those pages had errors that were easily detectable. Now, what I can say is that this was actually even a conservative result because we weren't looking at absolute accessibility. We were just looking, again, at some accessibility errors. And this should be right here, a call for action. But we also know that for many of you, you don't need a call for action. You need a call. You have a call for help, because web accessibility for you is desired. You want to do it, but you don't quite know, well, what happens next, because you do have those competing priorities. You do have limited resources. You do have limited staffing. Many of you don't have a webmaster on your own. You purchase a template, and if that template is not accessible, well, what do you do about it? And you do have limited time. So in thinking through all of these kinds of things, this is really the genesis for the guide that we created for the MacArthur Foundation. And our thought was, you know what? You commit to the work, and we're going to help you with those resources. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Whiting, who is going to talk about some resources that specifically will help you. John.
Sorry, little dead air there. Apologize for that. Let me get the slide transition going between my presentation and Cindy's. Okay. All right, thank you very much. If you're not seeing audio, or if you're not hearing the audio or not seeing the slides, please just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume everything's looking good and we're going to continue on. Okay, as Cindy said, my name is John Whiting, also with WebAIM. Just want to talk a little bit about the resources that we that MacArthur Foundation has made available. There is a link here, and I'm going to read the URL. Also, be happy to make sure that that ends up in the chat panel as well. So this is available at the MacArthur Foundation website. So that's macfound.org, macfound.org/accessibility. And accessibility is spelled ACCESSIBILITY. So please, feel free to join me at that site, because that is what we're going to spend the rest of the time primarily talking about. So the first thing that I just want to kind of talk about is the structure of these resources. These resources are structured with the idea that there's a lot to do. We have a lot of things that we want to accomplish, and sometimes the question is, well, where do I begin? So the way that these resources are structured is first resources for basically anyone who's creating content, making any updates to a website, sending emails, creating Word documents or PDFs. So what are some of the resources that are available? And I'll talk about and demonstrate some of those in just a minute. And then kind of branching out from there. So you have everything that you need, or not everything, but you have a good idea of maybe some of the things you need that you yourself should be doing. So maybe it's time to branch out a little bit, to go maybe one step farther, to go from yourself and kind of look within your organization. The next step after that, kind of if you continue to maybe move outside and think outside your organization, is to inform your community. So others maybe who are working to make resources more accessible, other people in your physical community and in your virtual community as well. And so that's how we've chosen to structure the bulk of the resources that are available. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to that MacArthur webpage, macfound.org/accessibility, and I am going to walk through a couple of those resources that are available. And I do actually, before we start, I do want to take 1 second to mention that we do welcome questions in the chat window. Probably what we plan to do is take a little bit of time at the end and go through all those questions as well. So I do also kind of try to keep an eye on the chat window. So if I see a question that I think is timely and I can answer, I might just answer that as part of this presentation. But please, feel free to ask questions within chat. We'll look at those toward the end. So this is that page that within the MacArthur website and these resources I was talking about. The introduction is an introduction from the MacArthur Foundation on the importance of this. The call to action is essentially the information that Cindy went through, and ending with a call to action. And then we have these sections. That first one, start with yourself. These are resources that hopefully everybody can benefit from. At least that's the goal. They're the videos that Cindy talked about, those web accessibility perspectives videos. Some of those are highlighted, as well as some other information, you know, kind of related to how to make things more accessible, just kind of general accessibility principles. If I jump back up to the top of the page, I try to use a keyboard as much as I can because I do work in accessibility. So I just hit Control and Home to jump to the top of the page. And looking at the next one, this is hopefully, you know, quite a bit of good information in this next section of things you can do today. So an example of that would just be to write clearly. There's some resources for information about clear writing, popular spelling and grammar checker, those kinds of things. Information about semantics. And by semantics, I mean the structural things that help you add meaning to the words on your page. So headings, lists, those kinds of things that make what you're looking at more easily digestible, chunked, those kinds of things. Those are also things that people using different assistive technologies can often benefit from. If, for example, someone is blind and using a screen reader to navigate through a page, a technology that reads everything as they interact mainly with the keyboard, they can jump from heading to heading, that kind of thing. It talks about the importance of contrast and color use, and some resources and at least a link on that. The importance of well-structured tables, good alternative text and how to provide that, links to a couple of resources, best practice on descriptive links, those kinds of things. And I won't go through every single resource, just a couple of them as we go through. I do have some resources for content creation tools. So what are the tools you're using to build these things? Are you using Word to write the content that's going to end up on the web page or to turn into a PDF? Many people are, probably most of you are using Word. We've got links to some resources on that. Some other featured resources on text editors, sometimes called WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get types of editors. And so those are things that are available as well. Just, you know, best practice on making that content more accessible based on the tools you're using to maybe add things into your own websites. Desktop publishing tools like InDesign, social media, some best practice on making social media more accessible. Things like adding alternative text to images, you know, using good links. Some of those things are reinforced in that social media sphere. And then some other resources as well. And I won't go through all of these, but information on more accessible multimedia, on testing. The WAVE tool that Cindy mentioned, there's some information on using the WAVE tool there. And because PDFs are such a pain point, even some additional information on how to make PDFs more accessible. I'm going to jump back to the slides real quick and talk about one important principle. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm a little audible here. I'm going to instead jump to Word. Microsoft Word, just to outline one just essential principle, and that is, how do you create headings in Word? For many of you, you're probably familiar with this. What if I have a main heading at the start of my document? A lot of times what we see people might do, just because this is how it's been done for years, is highlight that text and say, oh, you know what, I want that to be 16 point. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I want that to be 16 point. I like the color blue. You know, and I want to change the font as well to some other font that I prefer. And they do things like that. Well, visually that creates a heading, but if I'm, say, using a screen reader or navigating by the heading levels in a Word document, which you can do, none of that's going to be useful for me. And then I also have to kind of go back to the beginning when I want to write some body text. And then I create, say, a section heading. I'm not going to do a lot. This is just the last heading I'm going to create. And instead of going here and saying, you know, I want this to be 14 point, I want it to be this color. Instead, what you can do and should do is use this styles gallery that takes up most of the real estate on the home tab. I can instead say, I want this to be a heading 1. I can go down to this section heading, which I would say is kind of a second level heading within the page. I want that to be a heading 2. I know there's some shortcuts for that. If I'm on Windows and I am on Windows, I can hit Control and Alt together and hit the number 2. Control Alt 1, 2, or 3 will create those heading 1, heading 2, or heading 3. On Mac, if you're on a Mac, that's Command and Option 1, 2, 3. So that's such a little thing. It's a little thing to do, but it makes things so much more accessible. If I go to here in the View tab, and you don't have to worry about following along with this, but there's something called the navigation pane that allows me to also navigate through the document by the heading structure. I have this open almost all the time in any Word doc that I'm looking at because it's a much, much easier way to navigate through the structure, especially on lengthy documents, assuming it has good headings. So that's just one thing. You know, kind of what we want to do is highlight some of the resources and maybe highlight a couple of key takeaways. So that's maybe one key takeaway of those resources, you know, things that you can do if you start with yourself. Does that also apply to Google Docs? Good question. It does. So the Control 1, 2, and 3, I think only Control and Alt might be the only ones that work on Google Docs, but those work as well. You have the same benefits for all users and the same ability to navigate by headings. Good question from Gabriel. And I'll look at, I saw a couple other good questions come through that we'll maybe be able to jump to at the end here. So also the ability to test with Wave that Cindy already talked about, so we'll jump past that. The next group, that including your organization, there's a few resources there as well. Resources on supporting a system-wide change, creating a roadmap. And by roadmap, I mean, you know, what are the things that you're going to do and what are the timelines to accomplish those things? So I've jumped to that creating a roadmap resource within this website, these MacArthur Foundation resources. And so as I look through, there's information on what you would put in a good policy, on a tool to help you maybe create a policy. By policy, I mean, you know, what are the standards you're going to follow? What are the dates? When are you going to implement these changes? Those kinds of things. We'll talk about procurement. Essential if you're buying, especially if you're relying primarily on third parties. What are some ideas to to purchase things that are more accessible, and you know, those are some resources that are provided as well. And then some information on evaluating, and not just evaluating your website, which is important, your outcomes are important, but evaluating your process as well. And so that's that next section, or sorry, that second section on including your organization. Next in the list we have, I'm sorry, I got to remember what my own slides tell me to do. Again, I just kind of want to leave us with at least one maybe actionable thing for each of these sections. And I think one thing that any of us can act on right now, even just sitting here right now, is to consider one accessibility goal. And I won't go through all of maybe the principles of creating a good goal, but by goal, you know, there are wishes and there are aspirations, and those are essential, I think. But there are goals that are more concrete and achievable. So an example of a goal might be that on your website, you will have on your agreement. So if you buy something, you have a contract, you'll include accessibility language as part of that contract. And we have resources within what I just showed to help you understand maybe more about how to do that. One might be to publish an accessibility on your own website, say within the next 3 months. Maybe it won't say we meet all of the standards perfectly. Maybe it says we are working toward this. This is our commitment. Here's who to contact if you have questions or concerns, something like that. And maybe you have a goal to ensure that the template that you're using to create current web pages, to build existing web pages, maybe that those meet with certain guidelines, certain requirements, and those WCAG web content accessibility guidelines are also outlined within these resources. So, you know, that's something I would recommend, is maybe consider what is one goal, one thing that you feel is reasonable for your organization, something that can be completed within a certain span of time. And maybe that's something that you need to discuss, of course, with your organization. That's something you could do immediately. And that third section of informing your community, we provide some resources on how to connect with others, some links to some accessibility. And again, sorry, I'm going to jump to that website. Links to connect with others. There are, if you're maybe more of a website builder or developer, there's a resource for rallies, places where there's timelines and kind of contests to build more accessible websites. Some places where you can meet face-to-face, maybe within your community. I know we're at Utah State University in Northern Utah, and there's a group that occasionally holds meetups within the state of like-minded people who are working to make content more accessible. Places that you can collaborate online as well. Maybe places that you can give back and share within your community as well. Places to connect with others. Links to resources, to newsletters. Those are the types of resources that are available in here in this third section as well. If we talk about maybe one actionable thing within this, and I honestly, these are a couple links that we can throw into this as well that are available on the MacArthur site as well. So you can definitely go there in the resources and find these. But here's a couple of accessibility newsletters that you could subscribe to. One is Ally A11Y Weekly, A11Y being A and then 11 letters and then a Y for the word accessibility, 13 letters in total. Accessibility Weekly is a weekly newsletter that highlights a lot of important and useful resources. WebAIM, and I am, I work for WebAIM. We do publish a monthly newsletter as well. So that's another newsletter that you could subscribe to. Recommend maybe today subscribing to one of those, and we'll make sure that those links get put in the chat window as well. So that's another thing that you could potentially do, or maybe should do, maybe could do right now. I will go to the WebAIM website in just a minute and show you where that newsletter is available on that site as well. So one thing, most of the work that I do with WebAIM really is more for developers. And so while we were kind of working with the MacArthur Foundation and discussing some of these principles, I kind of recognize that maybe sometimes developers and designers are maybe a group apart. And so we didn't want them to be left out. We wanted to make sure that there are resources available for developers. Now, some of you maybe have developers on staff or are web developers. Most of your websites are really third party. You work with vendors or website builders. And so maybe these resources aren't as useful for you. But within this document, within these resources, we have some additional information that's maybe just a bit more technical. An example would be a deeper dive into these web content accessibility guidelines that are used as a foundation for laws and standards throughout the world. How are those structured? A little bit more about how to dig into those, find additional resources on those as well. More technical guidance on some web accessibility principles, like forms. Some of you may be building your own forms. Many of you maybe are not, or you might be using tools like, say, Google Forms. At the end of this, we will have a link to a survey, and it was built using Google. And so there's some resources on how to make sure those are more accessible as well. And I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. That's actually in the third party section of this, products like that. Additional tools and techniques in addition to Wave, some maybe more technical tools for people who really want to get into the website and dig around. Some more technical resources are available, like browser extensions, such as Accessibility Insights for the web that's available for Chrome, that we have links to, those kinds of things. So again, maybe some resources that are more focused on the needs of developers. And I do see that Cindy did paste those links into the chat. So for the accessibility newsletter, WebAIM discussion, also, I'm sorry, to our discussion list as well. So we do also have an email discussion list you're welcome to subscribe to, and Cindy provided a link to that as well. We do actually, I see a question about WordPress. So do we have a list of resources for WordPress? So let me just come up here to the third-party products. I believe it's in that section. I need to remember where we put our own resources. Yeah, so the first one here is WordPress. About half the websites on the planet use WordPress, and so we did kind of highlight WordPress. Some information about finding more accessible themes, plugins, and maybe experts specifically in WordPress accessibility that are linked to as well. Yes, and so that's something, and we do have some information on webinar platforms as well. I do believe it's in the same section. If it's not, I can find that and point you in the right direction on that. Oh, I apologize. That's actually under that share section in the communities about creating webinars and hosting webinars there. So that's where that information can be found, is in that section about your community. I mentioned Google Forms. Here's a resource on accessibility in Google Forms. Just quick look at the chat. Okay, and we'll make sure any other questions I didn't answer, we'll make sure to get to at the end here. So one resource for developers, if you're a developer and you feel maybe that you've been left out, you want something a little more technical to sink your teeth in here at the end, I would like to mention testing with a screen reader. And I shouldn't just say this is just for developers. I think lots of people can test with a screen reader. So you can maybe have a better understanding of the experience of someone who's blind or has other visual disabilities, who's maybe using a screen reader to access the website. We do have links in the resources I just talked about. We have links to NVDA, VoiceOver, and TalkBack. So NVDA is a good free screen reader for Windows. VoiceOver is built into the Mac operating system and into iOS, iPhones. So VoiceOver is built in, and we have information on how to access that. TalkBack is for Android. You can learn an awful lot by just opening a screen reader and having it read your web page, or opening a screen reader and having it, and maybe swiping down when you're on an iPhone, and that down swiping allow you to kind of navigate or read through things within the page. What I do want to highlight at the end here is resources on the WebAIM website. So I'm actually going to show how to find this. I'm going to jump back up to the WebAIM homepage. Again, full disclosure, webaim.org, that's me. I work for WebAIM, but we do have resources on our site specific to testing for a screen reader. So I'm going to click on articles. I'm going to come down here to evaluation, testing, and tools. And if I go to this evaluation, testing, and tools section specifically, and I will put a link to that in the chat window here, there are resources on how to use some of these tools. So NVDA is a screen reader that I have on my computer right now. I'm going to turn it on, and hopefully it's slow enough that it is useful for everyone.
Unknown. WebAIM, using NVDA to evaluate web accessibility. Google Chrome. WebAIM.
So don't worry about understanding everything, but I'm going to kind of go through this article. Sorry, it's hard. If I touch my mouse or hit my keyboard, the screen reader starts to read, and I don't want to talk over the screen reader. So I am looking here, and it tells me that to get to the article contents or to skip over them, I can hit the H key. So I'm going to hit H and see what happens.
Banner from Cindy Rowland to everyone. Evaluation, testing, and tools. https://webaim. Navigation landmark main landmark using NVDA to evaluate web accessibility. Heading level 1.
So right there, it told me that I'm at the heading level 1.
Closed captioning.
Heading level 1 is the first kind of highest level here of the screen reader. I'm sorry, of the web page. I'm going to hit the H key again.
Navigation landmark article contents. Heading level 2.
If I want to jump over the article contents into the page, I'm going to hit H again.
Introduction. Heading level 2.
I can also hit the tab key to go through these kind of section headings, these second level headings. I'm going to hit the 2 key.
Getting started. Heading level 2.
So it gives me information on the essential keys to get going, to download NVDA, those kinds of things.
Reading. Heading level 2.
Sorry, that was me. I shouldn't have hit the 2 key while I was talking. So it gives me information on reading. For example, if I at this spot hit the NVDA key, don't worry about what that means right now, but if I hit NVDA and down arrow on my screen reader, on my computer.
Heading level 2 reading. There are dozens of keyboard shortcuts that allow you to read content by line, sentence, word, character, etc.
If all this seems scary, I can just hit the down arrow and go kind of line by line or block by block through this page. So let me do that.
Should be able to list with 10 items. Bullet numpad plus. Start reading at the top of the page. Bullet NVDA plus down arrow. Start reading at the current position.
I'm going to jump down a little bit more.
Navigation heading left. Images heading left.
And show you a section where there's some kind of sandbox type practice areas built into this.
Image examples
built
and
into this resource. So if I go to this image examples and practice, I'm going to move my mouse out of the way. The screen reader might talk for a second as I do. Okay, so I'm going to hit tab to jump to these links.
alternative text link. Image examples and practice visited link. NVDA practice, images.
And I can navigate through some of these images. I know that if I kind of read through the page, it'll tell me information about this. For example, this first image.
Link. The following image has an alt attribute WebAIM web accessibility
That's
in
what a screen
mind.
reader will read when it comes to this image. So let me hit down.
Graphic WebAIM web accessibility
So
in
the screen
mind.
reader told me it was a graphic, and it told me what the
Closed captioning.
alternative text for this is. I'm going to mention one of the reasons that things are changing, or things are sometimes being read. This is excellent. In Zoom right now, we have captions that are going, and those kind of need to be read by the screen reader. So on occasion, that closed captioning window is kind of getting attention, and it's being read by the screen reader, which is a good thing. That explains some of that interruption. So I'm going to hit the tab key again. I'm going to hit the tab key now to jump down to a link farther down the page.
WebAIM web accessibility in mind graphic visited link.
And so it told me this is a graphic, an image, this is a link, and it tells me where it's going to take me. If it doesn't have good alternative text, I can practice that as well. What happens if I hit tab again?
Logo unlabeled graphic visited link.
Logo unlabeled graphic visited link. That's not very useful. That doesn't tell me anything. Well, it tells me I already went to this page once. It's visited, but that's all I know because that image isn't as accessible as it could be. And so I can test these things. Again, maybe especially if I'm a developer or designer building these things, but I think almost anyone with maybe an hour or two of practice can become comfortable doing some basic testing with the screen reader. And so there's resources in there about how to do that. So that's just an example of a final resource I wanted to highlight. I'm going to leave the screen reader open for one more minute just to see if anyone has.
From Michael to everyone. List.
The chat window also causes the screen reader to start reading. If anyone has any quick
From
questions
Michael
on a screen reader specifically, just while I have it open. Otherwise, we'll wrap up the end here.
No, or empty all.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out on the chat window. And I'm going to close the screen reader.
WebAIM web access. Exit NVDA.
Okay, and finally, what we want to mention is that there will be opportunities for discussion over the coming 2 weeks. Cindy did already mention this. So in this resource and we will provide the links in the chat window, and I believe in a follow-up email probably early next week. We will give you opportunities to participate in this, but we recommend you maybe join this now. We will be participating in an email discussion list for the next 2 weeks. If you would like to join that list, if you have additional questions that you feel, especially if they're maybe for accessibility and for nonprofits, kind of a missing area. The reason these resources exist is to encourage collaboration and discussion within nonprofits who are working on accessibility. This would be a good place to have some of those discussions. It is an email list, so you can send an email. That email will be sent to the group of subscribers. When you first send an email, it will need to be approved. So it might be just a while, an hour or two before you see that message come through. That's to keep spammers and people like that away from the list. Or you can send a blank email to the email address that's here in the slide, and I'll make sure that makes its way into the chat window as well. And just send a blank email, and it'll give you the information you need to subscribe. We do also have a brief 5-question survey that you're welcome to take, just about what you thought about this presentation, how helpful it was, recommendations, those kinds of things. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Cindy just to talk a little bit about final thoughts and maybe answer a couple questions here in the chat window as well.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I think that, oops, here we go. I meant to start the video as well. I hope that what you are coming away from this brief, and I know it was a very compressed time with a lot of information. Hopefully you don't feel like you're drinking from the fire hose. What we really wanted you to come away with was this notion that accessibility can't be ignored, that every organization does have an obligation to work towards it. And that given your own organization, you'll know the best way for that to happen. The culture of your organization, the leadership of the organization will largely drive what that looks like. You know, is it an actual policy and plan, which of course is something that we do recommend, or is it starting kind of small with, let's find a template that is accessible. Let's make sure our web developers that are in-house have had some web accessibility training. Let's make sure that everybody that adds content onto the web, let's say it's a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe it's a Word document or a PDF that gets linked onto our site. Let's make sure those people have had the support that they need to make their content accessible that ends up living on our organization's website. So coming up with, and Jonathan, you know, said this earlier, coming up with goals that are reasonable, taking, as we all know, what they say, that a journey starts with a single step. So within your organization, what is your single step? How can you get this moving? We really do hope that we've provided you with a very rich resource. If you go back to that link to look at some things that you can be doing, we hope that you'll do them. We hope that you'll consider participating in this discussion. There were some great questions on there. In fact, John, I don't know if you want to answer some of these now or do it in the chat itself. You know, one of the participants asked if we had recommendations on basically, you know, some platforms that are accessible. And I'm always going to defer that to the technical side of the house. But it is, I will say this one last thing too, before I let John answer. That can always be a moving target. In fact, we had a group we'd been working with for a while. They were so good. Their accessibility was just spot on. And then there had been some changes in leadership kind of at the top, and things over time sort of waned. And now they've got some real issues. So it's always hard from our standpoint to make a recommendation that is going to stand that test of time, because things can change. So really the best way to ensure this is to have a workflow that's always looking at accessibility as you go to add content, as you go to procure content, and maybe even every year, every 2 years, do a quick little scan, a little audit. How's our accessibility doing? But okay, John, let you hop in here and if you wanted to answer that question. Otherwise, I'll get right to the final things.
Yeah, I would appreciate it if Cindy or anyone else, if there is, if there are any questions that you feel that I missed as I'm going through these. One question was about maybe accessibility of webinar platforms and some of those. There's too many to keep track of, but we've had good luck with Zoom, which is what we're using right now. You'll maybe notice while I was using the screen reader, when there was a new chat that popped up, some new line in the chat window, my screen reader read that automatically. That's excellent, so that I can keep track of things as I'm going. Like, you know, if I'm relying on a screen reader just like anybody else, and so that's wonderful. Right. So Zoom has been the one that we've had the best of luck with. That doesn't mean there aren't other equally accessible webinar platforms. I think all the big ones are putting some work into it.
Yes, and I will state what I think is very obvious to the rest of you guys. We are working with a captioner. Sometimes folks roll the dice and think that they can just pull in automatic captions. This is a big fat no-go at this point in time. Auto captions are just a hot mess. So do work with well-respected captioning groups to get webinars and things like this captioned for your organization. Okay, go ahead, John.
I do want to mention one other question. It was a good question, and I've typed it in the chat, but I just want to make sure it is clear. We will be archiving this video. We will send out a link to that archived video. Relevant links will be included for things like the survey and the discussion list, which are both now in the chat window. We probably won't be providing the slide deck in part because it's all on the MacArthur website, and that was the primary point of this webinar, was to show those resources that are available there. If there's questions about specific resources, that'd be a great thing to bring up in the discussion list.
Right, right. Well, we are at time. Again, I really hope that we provided some information that's useful to you. Please do go to our evaluation. It's just 5 quick questions. It'll take like 3 minutes to do that. Please do join in our discussion, even if you're not so sure right now that you have something that you would want to ask. I'm going to invite you to lurk. John and I will be checking each day to see what has come in, and we're going to be, just as responsive as we can be. There may be some fabulous nuggets in there. The other thing too is I would invite those of you that are doing accessibility in the nonprofit world to share tips and tricks that you have learned and that you are using in your own organizations with each other. So on behalf of WebAIM and on behalf of the MacArthur Foundation, we want to thank you for giving us your time, and we want to really thank you for helping to keep web accessibility in mind within your own organization. It's so important for people with disabilities to be included in every aspect of our society. So thank you and have a great day.